This presentation is on the scientific process. So we will be covering the scientific process, including the guidelines for conducting science and the characteristics of science. So these are your learning objectives for this presentation, and these are all listed in your module as well. So describe the characteristics of science, apply these characteristics to research examples to determine if they represent sound science, identify the essential steps in the scientific process. You will need to describe the difference between a hypothesis and a prediction. And you will need to be able to describe an experimental design, which includes the variables, the control and treatment groups, replication, and analysis. And then finally, you should be able to design a scientific experiment. So I started the presentation with this quote from Bill Nye, and hopefully you've heard of him. Science is the key to our future. And if you don't believe in science, then you're holding everybody back. And I think that this is a good quote because it shows just how important science is to society. So we put this slide on here. There was a study conducted, well, it's been conducted many, many years, since I think like the 1970s, asking third and fourth graders to draw a picture of what they think of when they think of a scientist. And almost across the board, kids draw a white guy in a lab, sometimes with chemicals, with a microscope, whatever. But what this shows you is that our idea of the scientific community is very narrow and does not represent diversity that is required for a dynamic scientific community. So what is science and the scientific process? Well, science includes our knowledge of everything in the universe. Right, everything that we know about how life functions comes from scientific investigation. So it's a body of knowledge, but it is also a process that we follow in order to gain that knowledge. Now, what I want to go through first before we talk about the scientific method is some of the characteristics of science. So not every question that people ask and not every investigation qualifies as being scientific. So specific conditions have to be met in order for something to be considered science. And I put this image of a scientific checklist on here so you can see it summarized in one place. So first of all, science focuses on the natural world, what you can see around you and what you can test. It does not include supernatural beings or phenomena. And by this, I mean that you cannot test whether God exists. This is not a scientific question, which is not to say that it is a wrong question or a bad question, but it is outside the realm of science, right? That belongs to faith. And those are two separate entities. Now, I'm not saying that all scientists are atheists. There are many scientists who believe in God or some other deity, but this is not considered science because you cannot test for the existence of God. Another characteristic of science is that it is explanatory, and this is really important. You have to explain whatever it is you're investigating, right? The whole goal of science is to be able to generate explanations that are then supported by data and evidence that you collect. So the graphic that I put on here is the evidence for evolution. Now, before I talk about this, I'm going to write a definition on my slide. So many people do not understand the difference between a hypothesis and a theory. So we consider evolution a theory at this point. So let me write this down for you. So a hypothesis is a proposed explanation to something that you observe or a question, right? Whereas a theory has been tested so thoroughly, tested in many different ways, and it explains all of these different related phenomena, okay? So we don't say that a theory is 100% proven, but it is supported by many different studies, and they all support that theory. So it is thoroughly tested. So I'm going to write these definitions here for you. Okay, so a theory is as certain as we can get to saying that something is correct, right? Whereas a hypothesis is our proposed explanation that has not really been tested very much. Now, if you look at my graphic here, the theory of evolution, this is supported by many studies and in many different ways. So when we talk about evolution, the fossil record supports our theory of evolution. Vestigial structures, homologous structures. So if you look at this, all of these organisms in the picture are mammals. And you can't see it super well, but their forelimbs, the bones in their forelimbs are highlighted, and they are all the same in every mammal. We all have the same bones in our forelimb, and that is because we have a common ancestor, which supports the theory of evolution. You can also look at compare DNA, and then we can do selective breeding, which simulates evolution. So all of these different areas of investigation support this concept of evolution, and that is why it is elevated to the level of theory. Now, the scientific process has to include testing and evidence. So testing, you conduct testing or an experiment to determine whether a scientific idea is supported or refuted. And evidence refers to the data or the test results that you collect. Okay, so for something to be considered science, you have to be able to test it, right? It has to be concrete enough that you can run an experiment that either supports or refutes your idea. And I will talk a little bit more about that when we get into experimental design. Another characteristic is that science involves the scientific community. And what I mean by this is that research or scientific studies are peer-reviewed. So as a researcher, we publish our studies and our findings in scientific journals. And in order for our study to be published in the scientific journal, it has to be reviewed by other scientists in our field. And during the peer review process, we try to make sure that a study is designed well, the data was collected well, and that appropriate conclusions were drawn from that data or evidence. And that is kind of a way for scientists to check that reliable information is being put out into the community at large. Science also leads to ongoing research. So If you're asking a question or making an observation and you're going to test it, hopefully it is going to lead people or yourself into asking more and more detailed questions. I heard once when I was getting my degree that scientists do not work in a bubble, which means that we do not work as an isolated researcher, right? All of our research, our ideas, the things we look at come from the work of other people. It builds on their work. It's rare that you will have someone say, I'm walking out in nature and I come up with an entirely novel question or observation. Usually people have worked on some aspect of what it is I'm thinking about. And so I build on their work and make it more detailed. So let's talk about the scientific process. We talked about the characteristics of science, but now I want to talk about how we actually do science. So what I wrote here, science is not a linear process. So most of us have been taught the scientific method. You make an observation, you ask a question, you generate a hypothesis. This is not how science actually works. Okay, it's more of a fluid process. So for instance, when I think of a study or a question I want to ask, it's not that I'm out in nature necessarily making observations. A lot of time I am reading the work of another scientist, another researcher, and I think of a question related to their work that I want to explore. Okay, so I'm not really going into that observation step. I'm jumping right in to the question. So what I put here is, this is the graphic that you saw in your soft chalk assignment. It is more of a cycle rather than a linear process. So let's take a look at the first part. Now, many times the process does start with an observation, but not always, like I described. So if you look at my image here, maybe there is a new technology or a practical problem, or you're just curious, and that leads you to make an observation or ask a question. Maybe it's personal motivation. Okay, more and more scientists are turning towards research that addresses a problem, like a problem in society or a problem with the environment, a medical problem, things like that. Now, when we think of observation, a lot of times you picture, seeing something that you find interesting. But there are other ways to make observations. You can use your other senses. Maybe you hear something or feel something, touch something, or maybe you use a scientific instrument, a microscope, for instance, or chemicals to make an observation. So there are many different ways you can make observations. Now, a lot of times these observations lead to questions, right? And we base our studies on them. One thing I want you to remember here, though, is not all questions are scientific questions. They always say, well, there's no such thing as a bad question. Well, sure, that's true if you're a student and you're asking like a content-related question. But when you're talking about science, your questions you have to be able to test your question in order to answer it, right? It has to lend itself to scientific investigation. I'm going to write a note here for you. When I say you have to be able to test the question, that means you have to be able to design an experiment that will either support or refute your explanation. So after you've made an observation or you ask a question, you can enter what we call the testing phase. Now, again, it's more of a cyclical process. So you would gather data and interpret the data. Now, here is where I need you to understand some of our more scientific terminology. So testing involves developing a hypothesis, designing an experiment, and making predictions. It also, like you see on the graphic here, involves interpreting your data. Let's take a look at this. So a hypothesis is a proposed answer or explanation to your question or observation. Many of you have learned that a hypothesis is an educated guess, but I don't like to define it that way. It is not a guess. You are basing your hypothesis on information that you already know, you have read about in other scientific publications. Okay, so this is what I just wrote there is my explanation as to why a hypothesis is not an educated guess. Now, if you look at the scientific method online, I found that a lot of the websites teach it incorrectly. Your hypothesis is not your if-then statement. You can consider it a because statement. It is an explanation. So if you look at my example here, why is grass green? Now, this hypothesis doesn't contain the word because, but it is essentially an explanation. Why is grass green? Because the chlorophyll in the leaf cells causes the grass to be green. Chlorophyll is a pigment, right? It's an explanation. Why is grass green? Because of this. Now, here's another example. So this is, in this image here, is what we call the Red Queen hypothesis. So why do populations of rabbits become faster and faster, and foxes also become faster and faster? So the hypothesis is that rabbits evolve the ability to run faster to avoid predation by foxes, right? It is a defensive mechanism or improvement. But the fox is going to become faster, and it's not a fox in its lifetime. It's the population of fox or foxes, whatever the plural is, over many generations, and they become faster and faster so they can catch the rabbit. So it's an offensive improvement. So the hypothesis here, so the question is, why do rabbits become faster and then foxes become faster? Well, because rabbits are trying to avoid predation, foxes are trying to eat the rabbits. Okay, that is a hypothesis. It's an explanation. Now, I also wrote here that a hypothesis must be falsifiable. So take a second and think about what that word means. So falsifiable means that you have to be able to show that a hypothesis is supported or refuted with evidence, right? You have to be able to test that hypothesis, and you have to be able to refute it if possible, right? So let me write that down here. So if there's no way to prove a hypothesis is false, there is no way to refute it, then it is not falsifiable. And that goes back to this idea of science focuses on natural phenomena, not on supernatural. There is no way to prove or refute the existence of God because we cannot see God, we cannot test the presence of God. So it is not falsifiable. So a hypothesis must be falsifiable. Now, a prediction is based on a hypothesis. Okay, I wrote that right here. It states what you expect to observe as a result of your experiment. So this is your if-then statement. And again, it's not necessarily written if-then, but what I want to show you by saying it's an if-then statement is it's what you expect to observe as a result of your experiment. Okay, so let's look at this right here. If I'm trying to figure out what effect fertilizer has on plant growth, right? That's my question. What effect does fertilizer have on plant growth? Well, my hypothesis is that applying greater amounts of fertilizer increases plant growth because it provides the necessary nutrients, right? My because statement, my explanation. My prediction is based on my hypothesis. If I increase the amount of fertilizer, then the growth of the soybeans will increase in a linear fashion. Okay. Meaning my experiment, of course, would be to have soybean plants and to have some with no fertilizer, some with medium amounts of fertilizer, some with a lot of fertilizer. And I predict that as the amount of fertilizer increases, so does the growth of the plants. Okay, that is based on my hypothesis that fertilizer increases plant growth because it provides necessary nutrients. Oh, hold on here. Okay, I recommend you watch this video on your own. I like it because it very clearly and easily states points that you need to know about the scientific process and experimental design. So we've talked about observations and questions, right? You have to be able to test a question. We have talked about the fact that a hypothesis is an explanatory statement. You're trying to explain the answer to your question or your observation. A prediction is based on the hypothesis. It's what you expect to observe in your experiment. So now let's talk about the actual experiment or study. So there are two types of scientific studies, experimental and observational. Experimental is what you traditionally think of when you think of science. It's in a lab, you control all these variables. So experimental, you have a control and treatment group, and you can establish causation, meaning that one factor causes a change in the other. Fertilizer causes plants to grow more, okay? An observational study, these are often conducted in nature. This is kind of what I do when I study bees. I go out in nature, I record the different species of plants and how many there are. I record the abundance of bees and all the different types of bees, but I cannot establish causation. I cannot say flower diversity causes, like high flower diversity causes high bee diversity. I can't say that because I'm not controlling for other factors that could be affecting my results, right? So let's say nesting habitat in the area, like exposed soil, maybe that's affecting the amount of bee diversity I see. I don't know because I can't control that, right? So observational studies establish correlation, that in an area with high flower diversity, I have high bee diversity. I don't know if one causes the other, but they seem to be related to each other. Okay. So when I talk about variables and an experiment, and control groups and all that. I am talking about an experimental study, okay? So these are the variable types that you need to know. We have independent variable, dependent variable, control variable. So your independent variable is the factor that the investigator is changing or manipulating. And one thing I want to make sure you know here, you can only have one independent variable in your study. So you only change one variable at a time. And I want you to think about why that is. And if you're not sure why that is, go back and watch the video that I have embedded into this presentation. Now, the dependent variable is what you are measuring. Supposedly, it is dependent on changes in the independent variable, okay? And I'm going to apply this to a study in the next couple of slides. Now, finally, we have constant or control variables. Those kind of means the same thing. Now, remember that these are different than the control group. And I'll talk about that in just a minute. But these are variables that you do not change during the experiment. So let's apply these definitions to an actual study. Well, I'm going to go over experimental group and control group, then we'll apply it. So this image I put here is looking at the effect of water on plant growth, like how many seeds sprout. Okay, so the effect of water on seed germination, we'll put it that way. All right, so take a look here. Trying to find my arrow there. I'm looking right here. The independent variable in this study would be the amount of water. I'm going to write this here. So your question is, how about, does water affect seed germination? Germination just means the seed grows into a plant, right? Does water affect seed germination? All right. So my independent variable is the amount of water. I water the seeds or I don't water the seeds. And my dependent variable, the one I am measuring, it says the fraction of seeds that sprout. You can also just say the number of seeds that sprout. Okay. So I have a pot with a bunch of seeds that I water and a pot with a bunch of seeds that I do not water. Okay. Now, my experimental group, which is also called a treatment group, I'm going to write that right here. My experimental or treatment group is the group of seeds that receive the treatment or the addition of water. My control group is the group of seeds that do not receive water. So the reason that you have to have a control group is you need to have results from like your normal or standard conditions that you use to compare to your experimental results. So in other words, my control group shows me how seeds grow naturally with no water. And then my treatment group with the water shows me, okay, when I add water, this is how my seeds grow. I wouldn't know if water had an effect if I didn't have a control group, right? Maybe that's just how seeds grow with or without water. I wouldn't know. I have to have that control group so that I can see what happens to seeds when there's no water. Okay. Now remember, the control group is different than control variables. I believe I have that on my next slide here. Nope. Okay, so I'm gonna write a little explanation for that last statement here. So my control group is the group of seeds that do not receive water. I said control variables are different. Control variables are the factors that you keep the same between both groups. So that would be, for example, amount of sunlight, right? Type of soil, type and age of seeds. Okay, if I vary these between my two groups, how do I know whether it's the water that is causing the seeds to sprout, or maybe it's different amounts of sunlight, right? I wouldn't know. That's why all of those things that could potentially affect seed sprouting have to be kept constant, so that I am only changing one variable at a time, whether I use water or not. Okay, so this is an actual study, by the way, that I found. So some of you may have heard of the medication AZT. So we have used AZT for years to try to decrease mortality in people infected with AIDS. So here was the original study. So the hypothesis in this study, well, the question is, does AZT decrease mortality? The hypothesis is that yes, it decreases mortality because it suppresses the symptoms of AIDS by preventing the replication of the AIDS virus in human cells, okay? So that's your because statement, that's your explanation. You think it will decrease mortality because of this. Now your prediction, if we administer AZT to a group of individuals with AIDS, then we expect the group receiving the drug to have a decrease in their, I put T cell count, that's their white blood cells, and a lessening of symptoms compared to a placebo group. Okay, so my experiment is that I have a group of individuals with AIDS that get AZT and a group of individuals with AIDS that do not receive AZT. They receive like a sugar pill, a placebo. My prediction, which is based on my hypothesis, is that the group of individuals receiving AZT will have decreased mortality. And that is because AZT suppresses their white blood cell count, right? So this is the actual study I mentioned. So the sample group was 282 individuals. Now, we also call that sample size. I want you to think about why it is better to use groups of organisms, like many different soybean seeds, not different, but many soybean seeds, right? Like maybe you plant 100 soybean seeds in your treatment group, 100 soybean seeds in your control group. Why wouldn't I just use one seed? One soybean receives water, one soybean does not. Okay, so here they had 282 individuals with AIDS and a similar white blood cell count. The independent variable is whether the individuals receive AZT or not. Okay, that is what you are manipulating. You're giving the drug or you're not giving the drug. The dependent variable, that's what the researchers were measuring, is the T cell count in the participants, or the white blood cell count. So this is what I just said: treatment group, group receiving AZT, control group is the group receiving the placebo. So I want you to think for a minute why it is important, especially in medical studies, to use a placebo. So a lot of researchers have found that if you give individuals the pill with AZT and the control group no pill at all, That in and of itself affects your results, right? Because the individuals who are not receiving a pill, it affects like their stress levels, things like that, that can in turn affect the illness. So to keep that variable the same, they're both taking a pill. You use a placebo. I put here, try to name some control variables for the study. Well, you would probably want people who are around the same age group. You want people with no other illness, like for instance, AIDS a lot of times makes people susceptible to pneumonia. So you wouldn't want some individuals who have an active pneumonia infection and some without. So you want to keep those things the same. Now, these are the actual results that I was reading. So 19 individuals that received the placebo died during the experiment, and 45 individuals who received the placebo developed what they call opportunistic infections or like pneumonia. Whereas one individual who received AZT died and 24 developed like pneumonia. Now, this study was actually halted midway through, and I put here because of ethical considerations. At some point, you have to say, okay, this drug really does work. So is it even ethical to withhold the drug from our control group? In this case, the researchers decided it was not ethical. And so the reason that I put this in here and that I bring that up is science needs to take in consideration ethics, right? There have been times throughout history where we have not considered the ethics of an experiment, but in my opinion, we should leave those days behind us and consider the ethical implications of what it is we are researching or how we are researching. The science should be unbiased to a certain extent, right? But at some point, you have to take ethical responsibility for your research and for a study. So just to review, you need to know the scientific checklist or characteristics of science. You need to be able to understand how observations are made, generating testable questions, the difference between the two types of studies, observational, experimental, difference between a hypothesis and prediction. I need you to know the different types of variables and treatment and control groups. And so on your quiz and future assignments, I will give you, say, a question, and you may have to design an experiment, or I will give you an experiment and you have to recognize the independent variable, the dependent variable, things like that. Okay, that is the end of this presentation. And after this topic, we are going to be looking at evolution and natural selection.